The Edmonton Oilers have two stable forward pairings, Connor McDavid and Zach Hyman, Draisaitl and Vasily Podkolzin. What can the Oilers do to figure out what mix of supporting cast is going to augment their stars the best?
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And on today's show, we are going to talk about the Oilers forward conundrum. There are a lot of different strings and threads to tug on in this conversation, and I'm going to do my best to hit every beat I possibly can, but this is a very layered and complicated subject because the Oilers have more forwards than they need, but they can't find the right blend. So our first segment, we'll talk about what's working so far, the defined pairs that we mentioned at the top, Connor McDavid and Zach Hyman, Draisaitl and Vasily Podkolzin. Then we'll hit on the possibilities, Kasperi Kapanen, Jeff Skinner, Victor Arvidsson, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. And then in our final segment, we'll tackle what the mix probably looks like and why. I said this the other day, and I still think so. I do think the Oilers are in need of another forward, and we'll talk about that later on. So at the start, coming into this season, it's not really a shock to know that you want to build your lineup around McDavid, Draisaitl, Henrique as your 1, 2, 3. As you build out from there, you can start to kind of materialize or fill out the lineup card. And having that center depth is great for building out your lineup, for conceptualizing. That's the word I was struggling to think of. For conceptualizing out your lineup, because if you have those centers, you can start to plug and play with the wingers around them. And McDavid has played a ton with Zach Hyman over the last 3 years. They have great underlying results together. And I know Hyman started slow, but as we've talked about a lot here on the show, some poor shooting luck, some poor power play shooting luck in particular. He's been great since coming back on December 5th. And we'll hit those notes in a minute. But you go there. You spent, and your big free agent moves were to give Draisaitl massive upgrades on the wing. Last year, Draisaitl spent a lot of time with Evander Kane, with Warren Foegele, with Ryan McLeod. All of those guys were not options this year. And because of that, you have had to get creative. And the Oilers and Jeff Jackson, who was the GM at the time, who made the decision, saw the vision. We're going to drop Jeff Skinner, so Leon doesn't have to be the only one on his line who shoots, and Arvidsson, who's got decent underlying numbers and has a track record of being a strong forechecker that'll help us drive possession. We have two forward lines we feel good about. Then we have our third line, which was kind of a secret weapon for us in the postseason, where we have Henrique, Connor Brown, and Janmark. We have Brown and Janmark using their speed to disrupt, to forecheck, to create rush opportunities. And then we have Henrique to cover up defensively, to facilitate creation a little bit. And all of that is conceptual. And of course, as life would tell you, just because you plan things to go a certain way doesn't necessarily mean it's going to play out that way. And the challenge for the Oilers so far has been finding the right mix to play with Draisaitl and Podkolzin and McDavid and Hyman. We've talked about it a ton. In the first 20 games, Hyman was 3 goals, 5 assists in those first 20 games. In the 11 games since coming back, 10 goals, 3 assists. So I'm not as worried about Hyman. The positive regression made sense based on the math. If you were to go by per game, Hyman's on pace for 34 goals. If you were to go by his career shooting percentage and the pace for shots on goals, he would finish with 29.5. We'll round up. We'll give him 30 goals. As far as Podkolzin, he's already doubled the time he's played this year versus last year in Vancouver. He's spent 36.9% of his ice time against elite competition, according to Puck IQ, which is a database that tracks the quality of competition for opponents. Elite competition will be defined as first liners. In those Podkolzin minutes, he has a 56.6 dangerous Fenwick, which is just quality scoring chances against elite competition. So the Oilers are thoroughly and convincingly winning Podkolzin's minutes. In Podkolzin and Draisaitl minutes together, they have 59% of the scoring chances, 60% of the goals, 61% of the expected goals, 64% of the high danger chances, 7.2 shooting percentage. A little low. We'd like that higher, but that's okay. And then a 921 save percentage. Being that they have almost 300 minutes played together and the underlying results are as strong as they are, where they're over 60% or at 60% for the most part, I think you're going to see that duo stay together. Then it becomes a matter of, okay, who do we play on the right there? And then what does that do for our first line? Because if we're not going to play Podkolzin with McDavid and we're not going to play him on the third or the fourth line, he's locked in there. And I'm okay with that. I'm perfectly fine with Podkolzin being locked into that spot on the first line. All of that said, the Oilers are leaving meat on the bone, if you will. There's opportunity here for more efficient offense, for a more optimal lineup. And Ryan Nugent-Hopkins hasn't really played with the same vigor, if you will. He hasn't had the same offensive inclination as he's had in recent years. And some of that might be age-related decline. Some of it might just be stylistically. He doesn't necessarily fit what the Oilers are asking him to do in the McDavid minutes he's played so far, and asking a guy where he's going to be more inclined to be defense first because McDavid and Hyman are so offensive oriented. Naturally, his counting stats are going to take a bit of a dive, but it feels like a little bit more than that. The underlying results aren't as strong, and some of that is just the Oilers working out of that first month of the season funk. I do think over the course of a long season that McDavid's numbers are going to be in the right direction. And it's simply just a matter of ironing out who plays with who. And some of it is trial and error. You know, I'm not complaining, if you will, about the direction of the lineup. It's just, we have, 3 months, October, November, December now, of data and games to evaluate. We can make some determinations. We can say definitively, Podkolzin and Draisaitl need to stay together until it stops working. And if it doesn't stop working, it stays together. Then where do we go from there? Okay. McDavid and Hyman are working unequivocally. How do we augment what they do well? What type of skill set do they need? A few weeks ago, I had suggested maybe Jeff Skinner gets another look back up there, but being that he was healthy scratched against the Ducks, I don't necessarily think Skinner's going to be getting a first crack at a top 6 opportunity. Kasperi Kapanen is still floating around, Nugent-Hopkins, who we've mentioned, and Arvidsson, who has yet to really find a sticking spot for himself in the lineup. And some of it for Arvidsson has been injuries and trying to find his game, and that's okay. It's a long season, and part of that process is figuring out how pieces fit together, especially when you have this much turnover in a single offseason. I do think we forget how much work it takes to find an optimal lineup over the course of a season, even when you have superstars. A lot of people underrate how difficult it is to play with a great player. It's not easy to play with McDavid. It's not easy to play with Draisaitl, but the Oilers are finding ways. They do have work to do, but I am reasonably optimistic that they're going to be able to find the right mix of guys, being that they have so many options. And the trade market is still out there. So we're going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. And when we come back, we will start to tackle what the individual performances for Kapanen, Nugent-Hopkins, Arvidsson, and Jeff Skinner look like, and what we might be able to take away from that coming up next. When it comes to managing my money, it's hard to not keep track of all of the subscriptions that are out there. Rocket Money made it easy for me to track down every single one of my subscriptions. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower bills so you can grow your savings. Brings together everything all in one place. Whether it's subscriptions, spending habits, or financial goals for the year, Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 per year when using all of the app's premium features. For me, one of the best features is the subscription tracker. Used it to cancel some services I wasn't actually using anymore. Plus, with their financial goals feature, I've been able to set aside money for my future. No more stressing about budgeting every month. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/locked on. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday, New Year's Eve edition of Locked On Oilers ahead of the Oilers showdown. And look, I, for one, am not a big fan of playing on New Year's Eve. I think the NHL misses their opportunity. I think, frankly, you want to play all of these games early in the day to account for the fact that people like to socialize, that New Year's Eve is a social holiday. And look, I will be at a New Year's Eve party. I will probably have the Oilers game on at the TV, but I'm going to ask for a little bit of grace, a little bit of patience in getting out the Wednesday episode. It's going to come out, but probably later in the day. Probably will not be going live at midnight Eastern time to 10 p.m. Mountain time. Look, I'm going to be real with you. I'm going out. I will get an episode for you on Wednesday, but it's going to be later in the day. Okay. As far as solving this issue for the Oilers, I personally think the Oilers were a little too quick to pull the plug on Jeff Skinner in the top six. And look, some of this is just my preconceived notion of what Jeff Skinner is as a hockey player. And I think functionally, if he's not playing in your top six, you shouldn't play him. And obviously the Oilers agreed with me, because if he wasn't in the top six, they healthy bombed him to put Derek Ryan back in. Jeff Skinner's not a player you play on your fourth line. I suppose you could play him on your third line and move Janmark down, but like, fundamentally, what Jeff Skinner is still good at, skating in a straight line with speed, shooting from his designated spots, that is a useful skill set. And I don't think Skinner is as good of a skater as he used to be. I haven't done the NHL Edge data on him, but when you think about it abstractly, if you want to support McDavid's playmaking and his speed, you want to give him someone else that can play off of that. And Zach Hyman has naturally settled into that niche role of being McDavid's conduit. You know, if you want to get McDavid that full head of steam where he's skating the puck full speed into the offensive zone and he's pulling guys towards him, Hyman gets a lot more space. And it would make sense, in theory, if you were to have another player who could operate in that space, who's capable of scoring goals. You know, you think about it in terms of just skill sets, not even Skinner himself, but Hyman profiles as a goal scorer. You know, he shoots the puck at a high rate. He creates a lot of individual chances for himself off of what goes on around him. If you wanted to play someone, which the Oilers do in Nugent-Hopkins, who's a little more defense first, who's a little more worried about balancing the game out, I understand that. I still feel that there is meat on the bone for Jeff Skinner playing with McDavid. They did not get a particularly long run together early in the season, and it felt like there was some there were some okay underlying numbers, but bad on ice results, and clearly something the coaching staff doesn't like. That's the other component here as far as our Jeff Skinner discussion. It's one thing for me to sit here to look at the underlying numbers, to use my eye test, what I'm watching. But one of the things that's weird about hockey, that's a little bit different from football, from baseball, from basketball, even from soccer, is that people are looking at different things as the game's going on. And as much as I try to look away from the puck where the play is developing to really kind of get a feel for the game, it's hard to keep track of everything that is going on a given play. You know, if I'm watching a game, I am not really going to keep an eye on just Jeff Skinner in the neutral zone, in the offensive zone. I am sure the coaching staff has reasons why they don't want to play Jeff Skinner with McDavid or with Draisaitl. I'm sure there are things that I am not seeing that their front office and their coaching staff, who have more trained eyes, are. You know, is it his defensive effort? Is it his neutral zone effort? Is his forechecking effort? I think all of those questions are valid. You know, coming into the season, if you go back and watch the What to Expect from Jeff Skinner episode of the show, I told you, you're getting no defense. You're probably getting minimal transition work. But you give him the puck from designated spots and let him fire up that shot, you'll be reasonably content. I still think he can end up with 20 goals if he actually plays. But being that they don't have a strong feel for him, or confidence in him, I should say, that brings up the natural alternative of, well, who are you going to play in the top six? Well, Nugent-Hopkins did have a power play goal the other day against the Ducks. I feel that Nugent-Hopkins plays a bit better defense than what Skinner does. So if you just want to go based on that, the defensive impacts, and you want to say, well, Nuge is more two-way responsible. He's a bit more of a facilitator than, say, a shooter or a forechecker. And we can live with that trade-off because we want his defense there. We want him to compensate for what what McDavid and Hyman aren't as worried about. And look, you have to make concessions and trade-offs when we're talking about enabling good play. You know, you can't expect McDavid to be 100% full tilt, all three zones, all of the time. That's just not realistic. Now, that's not to say he can coast in the neutral zone or the defensive zone, but his priority is offense. So if you want to give him a defensive security blanket in Nugent-Hopkins, I'm okay with that. But in turn, you are leaving offense on the table. You are making a calculated decision of, well, if we can't get this much offense out of them, let's worry about our defense a little bit more. And that's fine. All of this is fine. You know, every coach, every organization has different philosophies. I've always operated under the idea that you want to put your players to do what they do best as often as possible. For McDavid, that's getting pucks on net with speed, transition play, cross-seam pass, lateral passes, getting defenses out of structure, getting goalies moving left to right. All of that is what makes McDavid great. So if you could give him another player who can play with a bit of speed, who has a good shot, it makes sense in the abstract. Now, as far as Kapanen, as far as Arvidsson, the Kapanen experiment is interesting because very clearly Chris Knoblauch likes something about his game. The fact that he stayed in the lineup over Jeff Skinner tells me that Chris Knoblauch likes something that Kapanen is bringing to the table. Kapanen definitely plays with effort. He definitely skates hard. His shot is nothing remarkable. He does not create chances for other teammates. If you want to play Kapanen on the third or fourth line, I think that's fine. I think if you're playing Kapanen in the Corey Perry spot, you probably have a better lineup. But to play Kapanen over Jeff Skinner is not something I'm going to agree with. And I understand that, you know, I'm doing Locked On Oilers. I'm not the coach of the Oilers, but I want the best possible 12 forwards to play as often as I can. And look, injuries happen, cold streaks happen. Sometimes it's not going to work, but you can't look at me and tell me that Kapanen is better than Jeff Skinner. He's not. And then you add Arvidsson to the mix, who they have tried with Draisaitl quite a bit, and the synergy might not just be there. And that's okay. You know, Arvidsson can definitely be effective on a third line, playing with Connor Brown and Janmark and Henrique, or playing with, probably more likely than not, playing with Henrique and Connor Brown and Janmark getting bumped to the fourth line. Hell, in an ideal world, if you could find ways to fit all of this, you can deepen and elongate your forward group. You know, if you can make Corey Perry and Derek Ryan part-time players, that's something to feel good about, because that means you've deepened and elongated your lineup, which means there's less fall off from line to line, which is the ultimate goal of a good team. We're going to take our final break of today's show. Be right back. We'll tie a bow on this forward controversy, seems like a strong word, but this forward conversation right after this. And thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers as we're getting you set for the new year. We'll talk about the game tomorrow because, you know, got to play the game. But looking ahead, it's very interesting because, frankly, coming into this season, the forward group made sense on paper. You know, the Nuge, McDavid, Hyman was fine. Arvidsson, Skinner, Draisaitl, second line. Connor Brown, Henrique, Janmark, and then Derek Ryan, Corey Perry, Podkolzin to start the year. It all made sense. All of those guys had clearly defined roles, and it made sense for what their skill sets were, and it was reasonable to expect they would be able to find success. The fact that Podkolzin has been effective as he's been is a really encouraging sign that A, the Oilers can identify talent in other organizations and recognize traits that maybe aren't translating as well in those places that the Oilers might be able to play in Edmonton. That's the first thing. Number two, it has brought an element of Draisaitl's game out that I wasn't necessarily sure was there. He has played really quality defense, and he's been a monster in terms of puck possession, and he's been really noticeable in terms of his effort at points this year, where he has made some really impressive one-man show plays. And all of that said, this is a good problem to have. Like, of course, you don't want a healthy scratch Jeff Skinner. You're paying him $3.5 million. You had high expectations for him. But, like, if you can realistically afford to scratch Jeff Skinner and feel good about your lineup, you have a pretty good forward group. And that's the thing here. The Oilers undoubtedly have a decent forward group. Do they have quality depth issues? Maybe. You know, they're not necessarily getting a ton of secondary scoring. I do think that's something that might be worth talking about down the road a little bit more, as far as why you would maybe want to add more depth to this forward group, because once you get past the big guns, there is quite a drop off. You know, you go from Draisaitl 55 points, McDavid 52. Your next forward's Hyman at 21, then Nugent at 19, then Brown at 16, Jeff Skinner at 12, Janmark is at 14, Podkolzin's at 12. You know, it feels like you probably need a little bit more offense from your depth. And look, the Oilers are structured the way that their formula for success. They are built to dominate on special teams, power play, penalty kill, win the McDavid Draisaitl minutes, and then anything else they get is gravy. You know, anything else you get that isn't on a McDavid or a Draisaitl line at 5-on-5, that's supposed to be the cherry on top of the sundae, if you will. You can't bank on that consistently to be getting the Henry, Janmark, Connor Brown, Derek Ryan, Corey Perry. You can't be banking on those guys to give you a goal every game, that configuration. You know, if those six guys, if you get one goal every game from those six guys, you're going to win most nights. You know, we talk about all the different permutations, the recipe the Oilers need of, well, just don't make Stuart Skinner do too much. Don't make the defense do too much. Let the stars handle the bulk of the heavy lifting. Let them control the play, and everything flows out from there. If you win the McDavid Draisaitl minutes, everything else falls into place. You win those 5-on-5 minutes, everything else becomes infinitely easier. And building that out is the Oilers' elevator pitch. They have constructed this roster this way because it is their easiest path to victory based on the talent they have. You know, in an ideal world, you would want a little more shooting talent. You would want a little better defense. But the Oilers have spent their money. They have made their decisions as far as how they want to build this roster. With money committed to your stars, you need to find quality supporting cast. And the Oilers have chosen guys who can skate, guys who check, and guys who have experience. And all of those traits have different levels of worth. I feel like there is no one size fits all as far as what depth looks like. If anything, you want to have a variety of depth. But I still think you probably end up with Skinner and probably, frankly, Evander Kane getting top 6 looks on this team come April, come May, hopefully, because the Oilers have them in the chamber. You know, I don't think there's a Jeff Skinner trade to be had here. You know, do you really want to give up on him for like a 5th round pick from a mediocre team? Like, sure. Would a team like Minnesota want Jeff Skinner for the deadline as a depth forward? Yeah. But the Oilers don't want draft picks. They're trying to win right now. Draft picks don't help you if you're trying to win right now. If anything, that slows you up. That's why I feel the Oilers should try and stay the course and figure out what they could do to bring more out of him. I'm very happy with the decisions the Oilers have made in hindsight. You know, Skinner, Arvidsson are reasonable. Emberson, reasonable. Podkolzin, reasonable. All of the decisions they made as far as personnel, I understand what they were trying to do. And that's really all I ever ask. I'm never going to agree with every decision the front office of a team makes. That's just not how it works. Everybody has their own opinions, and everybody has different processes for coming up with their opinions, for formulating their opinions. Some people are more video inclined. Some people are more statistics inclined. Some people like me like to do a little bit of both, and trying to find the best and most actionable version of the truth is the goal for me in a player evaluation. So I like what Podkolzin brings to Draisaitl's line. The Oilers need to keep riding that until it stops working. Then we can have a different conversation. But right now, you're not breaking that pairing up. You're not breaking up Hyman and McDavid. I would like to see Jeff Skinner get another run with McDavid. I know I've said that a few times this episode. I've said that a few times this season, but I think there's something there. And the underlying results were decent. The actual results were not. I think that is a more productive use. Of course, that lends the natural question, well, what do you want to do with Ryan Nugent-Hopkins? That's a good question. I don't know what you do with Nuge at this point in his career. I think Nuge still has hockey left in him. I don't think he's completely washed, but I do think his role probably needs a bit of refinement. I do think it would benefit him to maybe play a little bit lower in the lineup. If you were to play Jeff Skinner on McDavid's left, you would probably drop Nuge to the third line and play him with Henrique and Connor Brown. You would drop Janmark down to the fourth line, and you could push Corey Perry out of the lineup. That would be something I would be interested in if I were in charge here. But being that I'm not in charge, being that I'm doing Locked On Oilers, I will say thank you to everyone who got on board this year. I took over the show kind of haphazardly in mid-April, right at the start of the playoffs, and it's been an incredible journey for everybody who's gotten on board since. Doubled the YouTube subscriber count, which is a really, really validating feeling that I'm not just talking into the void sometimes. I've got good ideas as far as new content for the new year, and I'm very excited to get to it. We'll get more guests. We'll do more crossovers. We'll try and fulfill a more engrossing and detailed experience for 2025. That's my goal for the show. We're going to do New Year's resolutions for every player on tomorrow's episode. We'll talk a little bit about the game as well. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you happen to be listening on Apple or Spotify, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button as we push for 2,000. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Everyone have a safe, fun New Year's. Talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.